WNBA star Brittney Griner has been released from a Russian penal colony in prisoner exchange. I'm Tyrone Bowman. This is Tyrone Bowman Tonight. According to the Wall Street Journal, the American women's basketball star was traded for a Russian arms dealer in a deal that came after months of negotiations between two hostile superpowers. Women's basketball star Brittney Griner has been released from a Russian penal colony and is being returned to the U.S. through a prisoner exchange for Russian arms dealer Victor Bout, which culminated on Thursday with a Cold War style handover on an airport runway in Abu Dhabi. The swap capped a drama that began in February when Ms. Griner, a 32-year-old two-time Olympian and center for the WNBA's Phoenix Mercury, was on her way to a high-paying professional basketball job in Russia during the U.S. off-season. She was detained after landing in Moscow with less than a gram of Haddish oil in her luggage, days before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ms. Griner was later convicted of drug smuggling and possession and sentenced to 9 years in a penal colony. The U.S. deemed Ms. Griner had been wrongfully detained, a designation that obligated it to work to obtain her release. That set off a tense months-long diplomatic negotiation between the two superpowers at perhaps the lowest moment in their relations in decades. A breakthrough came in recent days. Earlier this week, Ms. Griner was moved from a penal colony in Moldova, about 350 miles northwest to Moscow, the city where her imprisonment had begun. A U.S. official said Mr. Bout, meanwhile, was given a conditional grant of clemency that was not completed until Thursday, when U.S. officials in the UAE verified Britain was there too and ready to return to the U.S. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said a plane carrying Ms. Griner landed at a UAE airbase Thursday at 4 p.m. local time. About 45 minutes after the plane carrying Mr. Bout said a person familiar with the exchange. An hour later, with the planes on either side of the tarmac, Mr. Bout walked across to the Russian plane, and Ms. Griner then crossed to the U.S. plane, the person said. After months of being unjustly detained in Russia, held under intolerable circumstances, Brittney will soon be back in the arms of her loved ones, and she should have been there all along. President Biden said from the White House on Thursday, flanked by his Vice President, Secretary of State, and Cheryl Griner, Brittney Griner's wife. This is a day we've worked toward for a long time. Ms. Griner was being accompanied back to the U.S. by the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Roger Carstens, the State Department said Thursday. Mr. Carstens was a key member of a cast of U.S. government and private sector figures pursuing her release. The President of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince helped broker the settlement, the two countries said in a joint statement Thursday. The effort to free the athlete put a spotlight on the inner workings of prisoner diplomacy in both the U.S. and Russian governments. The countries traded barbs and grievances for most of 2022. American officials accused Russia of meting out sham justice, refusing to negotiate in good faith, reneging on its diplomatic obligation, and holding people in poor prison conditions. Russians said Ms. Griner had broken their laws, that the U.S. was trying to circumvent their justice process by calling for her release even before her trial, and then conduct negotiations to what officials called megaphone diplomacy after years of seeking the arrest of its citizens in third countries. Ms. Griner's release came after her supporters in the U.S. initially kept quiet about her plight and then mounted an increasingly vocal campaign as it became clearer that she would only be freed through high-level, high-stakes negotiations. It also came with a significant and controversial shadow hanging over it as the U.S. failed to find a path to free another American that the U.S. designates as wrongfully detained in Russia, former Marine Paul Whelan, who in 2020, Mr. Whelan was found guilty of espionage and sentenced to 16 years by a Moscow court. Mr. Whelan's twin brother David said Thursday that the Biden administration made the right decision to bring Ms. Griner home and to make the deal that was possible rather than waiting for one that wasn't going to happen. But in the statement, he also said that the news was a catastrophic for Paul, asking, how do you continue to survive day after day when you know that your government has failed twice to free you from a foreign prison? The prisoner swap was hailed by their supporters in both countries. Ms. Griner's agent, Lindsay Kagawa Kola, said that throughout this ordeal, BG has carried herself with courage, grace, and grit. And President Biden made us a promise and then kept his word and did what was necessary, to bring her home. Cheryl Griner said that she was overwhelmed with emotion. But the most important emotion that I have right now is just sincere gratitude for President Biden and his entire administration. The exchange for bout for Griner can be called a New Year's gift. Russian High Commissioner for Human Rights Tatiana Maskalovaka said, cited by state newswire TASS, joy overwhelms everyone who followed his fate. Victor Bout's name had regularly surfaced in U.S.-Russian relations following his sentencing in 2015 to 25 years in prison for conspiring to sell weapons to people he believed represented Colombia's FARC rebels, but were actually DEA agents. He had been detained initially in Thailand since 2008. By 2022, however, he was on a track for release within 5 years and had secured support for his release as a part of a trade from figures including the U.S. District Judge who sentenced him, Sharia Shendelin. Ms. Shendelin, who is now retired and works as a mediator and arbitrator, said in an interview earlier this year that she had long considered 25 years imprisonment to be excessive for a sting operation and had regretted that it was the mandatory sentence she had to impose. The Russian Foreign Ministry confirmed the exchange on Thursday. The Russian citizen has been returned to his homeland, the ministry said on the social network Telegram. Mr. Bout will soon be invited to a hearing at the State Duma, Russia's lower house of parliament. Leonid Tutsky, a top Russian lawmaker, said Thursday, pardon the mistake there. His U.S. lawyer, Steve Sasu, said in a statement on Thursday that Russian President Vladimir Putin never gave up on him during the 15 years of his wrongful incarceration, just as President Biden and the U.S. State Department never gave up on Ms. Griner. In the U.S., domestic reaction to Ms. Griner's release was not uniformly positive, with some senators raising concerns about Mr. Wheeling not being included in the deal and saying that the trade was lopsided for freeing Mr. Bout, who was dubbed Merchant of Death by some of his detractors. U.S. officials said yesterday that the Russians made it clear that the only route to securing Ms. Griner's return was the release of a Russian national. One of the officials said of Mr. Bout, nothing can remove the stigma of his guilty conviction in the U.S. justice system. Ms. Griner is likely headed to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, officials said, the first stop for her reintegration back into the United States. There she would receive medical and psychological evaluations. The official said the Texas facility has long supported Americans as they first return overseas from captivity, which can take weeks as citizens are gently reintroduced to their communities. Welcome home, Brittney Griner. I'm Tyrone Bowman. Never surrender, never quit.